Good day, everybody. This is Watson Michael from Ceylon Institute of English and Leadership. Today we have with us Dr. Ravi Fernando. He's on 8 multinational and local boards in the world. He is an alumni of the University of Cambridge and INSEAD Business School. Having completed all his sustainability studies, that is postgraduate and masters at Cambridge, and all his strategy studies at INSEAD Business School. He is a visiting faculty in INSEAD Business School and is an executive in residence there. Dr. Fernando created the 21st century board leadership model, which was developed in June 2020, and a US copyright was secured. It was converted into a masterclass that is now being taught in Luxembourg, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Sri Lanka. Soon to be launched in Malaysia, Vietnam, and India by 2022. And so today, we warmly welcome all of you for the first episode, which is called, season 1 is called 21st Century Leadership Challenges Series. And the topic is climate emergency. And we are going to ask Dr. Fernando our first question. So Dr. Fernando, usually all of us call it climate change. But why are you calling it climate emergency?
A very good morning or evening, depending on where you're watching this from. Thanks, Michael, for those kind words of introduction. And I'm indeed very happy to be able to share my thoughts on the 21st century challenges in this series. And today we are starting with the first challenge, which is climate emergency. And I think a very pertinent question you have asked me. So why am I referring to it as a climate emergency and not simply climate change? And the reason for that, Michael, is that way back in 1987, we began to see a very important UN-driven report that came out. And this report was titled Our Common Future and published for the United Nations by a team of UN designated leaders, including the leader, Prime Minister of Norway, Brundtland. And this report at that time basically drew attention to the world's leaders and said, we are facing a massive climate change. And we are facing this climate change because of the world's leaders, because in our energy sourcing, we have moved into a fossil fuel driven era from 1880, when the Industrial Revolution started. And at that time, we started with coal power, and then moved into petroleum, to diesel, and to natural gas.
Okay.
And these 4 items are fossil fuels. And the report clearly said the reason for the climate change at that time, they said, was because of the excessive burning of fossil fuels, which release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we call these gases greenhouse gases. And that these gases, carbon dioxide, is getting trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. And when it gets trapped in the Earth's atmosphere, the planet gets warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer. And then we call it global warming. And that as a result of global warming, that the planet's climate is changing dramatically. Okay. So if you go back in time, in 1987, 34 years ago,
okay,
the red flag was put up and a SOS was put out to all the world's leaders, okay, saying there's a connection between the climate changing and the burning of fossil fuels. And as a result, we are beginning to see the climate changing so much that we are beginning to now experience various extreme weather events in the world.
Okay.
And called on all nations after the report in 1987 to immediately start a transition from polluting fossil fuels. And I want to repeat the fossil fuels because people sometimes, when I say fossil fuels, they say, so what is fossil fuels?
Yes.
So number one fossil fuel is coal. We dig it out of the planet, the earth. Number two fossil fuel is petroleum. And that also we dig out from the earth's ground. Diesel, which is a refinement of which is a unpurified version of it. And then we also have natural gas. Now, people, when the moment we say natural gas, we all think, aha, that's all right. It's natural. I can tell you, natural gas is a fossil fuel. So, in 1987, there was a very urgent call. Climate is changing. We have studied the science, and all nations must now begin an urgent transition from fossil fuels to what we call renewable energy.
Okay.
So what are renewable energy? Number one is solar power. The sun is out there shining on us 365 days in a year. If we can harness 1 month of sun's rays on the planet, that's enough to power the entire planet for 1 year. Wow. So please start harnessing the sun's power. And that was the solar side. Then you have wind power, which is harnessing the natural resource of wind. And the solar power is harnessing the natural resource of the sunlight. And then besides that, there was also wave power. So the power of the oceans, as you know, the planet has 70% of the planet is oceans, and which have waves. So start using wave power, harness the natural waves in the ocean. And also look at geothermal power, which is also can be and you turn that into a renewable energy source. So make this transition. So the reason we are now in 2021 referring to this issue, which was highlighted in 1987 as a climate change, is because we have ignored 34 years of scientific evidence that fossil fuels are causing the crisis of global warming and the crisis of extreme weather incidents, which we are now facing today. So the reason we are now referring to this very important item as climate emergency was in the last 20 years, out of the 34 years, we have seen a dramatic rise of global temperatures. And the last 20 years recorded history over millions and millions of years of recorded history were the 20 hottest years ever recorded on the planet.
Wow.
Right? Ever. And 2021, I can now confirm to you, as per the World Meteorological Organization, whose report came out in May this year, was confirmed as the hottest ever year recorded. And July was considered the hottest ever single month recorded in the last 20 years of the increasing global temperatures.
Wow.
So the bottom line is this is happening absolutely right now. It is now happening to us. So the World Economic Forum, WEF, which meets every year in Davos, select the world's greatest risks every year. And they selected climate emergency-led extreme weather as the world's #1 global risk. For 2020 and for 2021. They said the second biggest risk to the planet is climate action failure of leadership, right? So they said the first risk is extreme weather because of climate emergency. Second risk is the climate action failure of national leaders, business leaders, and leaders of organizations, and you and me. That
Okay.
all of us, there is a climate action failure.
Okay.
And the reason now we refer to this as climate emergency is because, according to the World Meteorological Organization, we will cross the first dangerous climate global warming milestone of plus 1.5 degrees centigrade from the base year of 1880 in 2025. So 2025 is just 4 years from now.
Okay, so that's up to 45 years. Okay. Right.
Exactly. So not,
Wow.
34 years since the first report, but basically in 2025, which is now 4 years from today.
Okay.
And what they say is, if the planet crosses the 1.5 degree barrier, extreme weather incidents will impact the global economy to the tune of $54 trillion to $67 trillion. Now, why is that very important? It's important because the global economy is $90 trillion. So if $57 trillion to $67 trillion are going to get wiped out of the global economy, when we move to 1.5 degrees centigrade to 2 degrees centigrade, that means 60 to 70% of all the global economic development in GDP terms and profit terms is going to get wiped out in the next 3 to 5 years in front of our eyes. And as you know, these extreme weather incidents come in three forms. Number one, global warming. Temperatures keep rising. And I have already told you that we are about to cross this dangerous point of plus 1.5 degrees centigrade. We are now in 1.2 degrees centigrade. So in the next 3 years, we will get to 1.5. That's according to the World Meteorological Organization. So the heating of the planet, our temperatures, is the first extreme weather incident. Right. And today, if you look at the world, majority of the world's countries are experiencing their hottest ever recorded temperature, average temperatures for a year in the last 2 to 3 years. Every country. And we are now beginning to see temperatures between 40 degrees centigrade and 55 degrees centigrade recorded on the planet. Even in the Arctic, which is the North Pole, which is supposed to be the fridge of the world, or freezer of the world, in July 2021, last 2 months back, it recorded plus 45 degrees centigrade.
Wow, that's a lot.
That's a lot. So number one is we are seeing extreme temperatures. That is the first extreme weather incident. The second extreme weather incident is drought as a result of extreme temperatures. So if you have extreme temperatures, you will end up with drought, because those temperatures are going to take out of the Earth's atmosphere all the moisture, all the water, atmospheric water, groundwater is all getting sucked out when temperatures are high, and now we end up with a drought. So the second extreme incident is drought. Right. As a result of extreme weather temperatures. It is all connected. Now, when you have all the Earth's atmospheric water and groundwater pulled out of the Earth's atmosphere due to high temperatures, this water ends up in the clouds. The clouds become heavier and heavier and absorbs all the water that's around, because the heat now is so unbelievable that all that water is taken out of the Earth's atmosphere.
Okay.
Then what happens is all these clouds become heavier and heavier. Finally, you have unbelievable, unprecedented flooding and tornadoes and hurricanes, because the clouds have now got filled with all this water. Then you have flooding. So the beginning of the problem is the warming of the planet. It's global warming that leads to these three weather incidents of drought, high temperature, and flooding.
Okay.
And today, all you have to do is watch the weather report. And I think all the global media channels should no longer call it the weather report. They should call it the extreme weather update.
Okay.
Right? Extreme weather update, because this is no longer like a walk in the park. Tomorrow it might be a sunny day. I'm telling you, that is why the world is all relaxed, because they are thinking that the weather report is just an update so that we might have to take an umbrella out when we go out of the morning. Now, I'm telling you, this is not the weather report you're getting today. Today, the date is September, what's the date? 4th. On the 4th of September, if you turn into any of the world channels, here's the extreme weather update. Number one, California is having one of its worst ever forest fires.
Okay.
So why do you have forest fires? When the temperatures go up and the atmospheric and groundwater in a forest is removed, then it self-ignites into forest fires.
Okay.
Right? So today's update is 4th September, forest fires in California, and unprecedented forest fires in Brazil, and unprecedented forest fires in Russia's Siberian forest cover, which is taking away 50-60,000 hectares of land, burning down. And we also had forest fires in Australia.
That's a lot.
Today's update will tell you, number one. Number two, it will tell you unprecedented flooding in Louisiana, USA. And we had unprecedented flooding in London, where even the tube stations went underwater last month.
Okay.
And most of the tube stations in London went underwater. Now we are having the same thing happen in Louisiana. We had the same thing happen in Maharashtra, India. And we had the same thing happen in China, all in the last 2 months. So that is the extreme weather update confirming that we now have a climate emergency. And this is no longer something to be taken lightly, that we just have some climate change and, you know, we move on to the next topic, right? The climate emergency, if we don't address it by exiting and transitioning to renewable energy in the next 3 years, we will face 70% of our GDP wiped out, national economies wiped out, and business profits wiped out in the next 3 years. So that is why it is an emergency, a call to action amongst all world leaders, all business leaders, all leaders of any organization. And last but not least, it's a call to action to you and me, and what we do in terms of how we live to become a part of the solution to the climate emergency. I mean, right now, if I look outside of my window, we are having an unprecedented climate emergency event where it's raining like in the movies. We are having, I can see my garden is already flooded, right? When I just look out of my window. So now you know how floods happen, right? We are having 1 month's rain in 15 minutes. We are sometimes having 6 months rain in one day
Mm.
because of all the water that has got absorbed into the clouds because of the heat. So if you
Okay.
don't take the heat out, we will have unprecedented extreme weather events. So I hope with now I have given everyone listening a very good idea of what is the climate emergency.
Mm. Okay. Great. Great. So, what do you think, like, Dr. Fernando, like, how we could, like, this climate change, how we could prevent it, or like, how we can move forward?
Okay. So for a long time, we were talking of, the world's leaders were talking of climate emergency mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, how do we stop the climate emergency from happening? Now, I can tell you today that we have long passed the time for mitigation. We are now only talking about climate emergency adaptation. So, what's the difference between mitigation and adaptation?
Okay.
If world leaders woke up to the 1987 report
Mm-hmm.
and started taking action at that time to
Mm-hmm.
transition to renewable energy sources and exit fossil fuels from 1987, by now we would be 100% in renewable energy in the last 34 years.
Okay.
That did not happen. That would have been a mitigating strategy. But world leaders ignored the reports, ignored the climate emergency, just thinking that it's just climate change. And from 1987 to 2021, there have been a series of events and programs and reports and commitments made by various leaders at various times, starting with the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro,
Okay.
where 190 countries got together and said, we must exit fossil fuels by 2000. And
Mm-hmm.
then we had the Paris Summit in 2015 December. And then they said, let's exit fossil fuels by 2030. And then now we are about to have COP26, which is all the world leaders meeting to address the climate emergency in Glasgow in November this year.
Okay.
And they are already talking about trying to solve the problem by 2050.
Okay.
So what all that the world leaders have done between 1987 and 2021 is, number one, ignored the science. Number two, ignored changing climate. Number three, ignored transiting from fossil fuels that are burning up the planet to renewable energy.
Okay.
And between those 34 years, what we have seen is global temperatures have moved up from zero in 1880 in terms of increased temperature base year to plus 1.5 degrees centigrade. Number two, the amount of gigatons of carbon dioxide burnt out in the atmosphere has, due to burning fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, diesel, and natural gas, moved up from 20 gigatons
Wow.
to 33.9 gigatons now. That means an increase of 13.9 gigatons in the last 34 years, when everyone said we are going to reduce the number of gigatons of carbon dioxide. If all these world leaders took action and did the right thing to mitigate the climate emergency, then by now we would have either seen a holding pattern for release of carbon dioxide or a reduction.
Okay.
You would have seen 20 gigatons going down to maybe 18 gigatons, or 20 gigatons at least remaining at 20 gigatons in 2034. But the classic climate action failure, which is the second emergency that is reported in the global risk report, is where leaders who all made all these commitments, made all these promises, in the last 34 years at various events have basically completely, catastrophically let the planet down through inaction and lack of leadership. And today we are at 33.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide from a 20 gigatons in 1987.
Wow.
And last but not least, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the late 80s, when this report came out, was what we call 280 parts per million.
Okay.
This figure has moved up to 420 parts per million in the last 34 years. So once again, confirming that in the last 34 years, world leaders, business leaders, organizational leaders, and you and I have comprehensively and completely ignored the climate emergency, because that figure should have remained at 280 or gone down in terms of parts per million to 250 parts per million by now, if the leaders had taken 1 ounce of action to change this climate mitigative action. So now we are in a crisis situation, and the sad thing is we keep postponing when the action has to be taken. We initially, in 1987, we said we will do this by 2000, all the world leaders. Then in 2000, we said we'll do it by 1992, we said we'll do it by 2000. Then in 2000, we said we'll do it by 2015. Then in 2015, we are saying we'll do it by 2030. And now in 2021, when we are reviewing these commitments made in 2015 December in Paris, now I can see all the world leaders are kicking the can. The irresponsibility is zooming to another level, and they are saying, let's sort this out by 2050, when the World Meteorological Organization has categorically said we will cross danger point number 1 in 2025, when temperatures will cross plus 1.5 degrees centigrade, which will lead to a 20-foot sea level rise, and which will then lead to a wiping out of between 54 and 67 trillion dollars from the global economy of 90 trillion dollars.
Okay.
So catastrophic leadership failure. And this is why, in a small way, I created what is known as 21st century leadership model, board leadership model, to address this at a business level.
Okay.
And that is the purpose of my program, because I realized that we cannot count on political leaders to solve this problem for us. We have counted on them for 34 years, and they have let the whole planet and all future generations down in a very irresponsible inaction and inactivity and lack of resolve and science denial. Now, my hope is in the business world. My hope is that the business leaders will understand this, because all the business profits they are going to gain are going to get wiped out. And I created this model, and I've been talking about this subject in a very focused manner from about 2005, when I published my first book, Strategic Corporate Sustainability, 7 Imperatives for Sustainable Business, from 2005. So now it's almost 16 years of talking about the same subject. And I think by and large, a lot of inaction in the parts of the leaders. So this model that I created based on Yuval Harari's book, 21 Lessons for the 20th Century, I created this model to try to light a fire under all the leaders who are running a business today and get them into urgency for the climate emergency to exit fossil fuels and move to sustainable business models. And this model masterclass is now a masterclass which we teach over a 7-module series. Launched it in Luxembourg in September 2020. with the Institute of Directors of Luxembourg. We have now launched it in Ireland with an organization called the Cube, which is their carbon reduction organization in September, and United Kingdom. And we have launched it in Sri Lanka with the Chartered Accounting Body of Sri Lanka, CA Sri Lanka, in July this year. And
great.
like you said, we are hoping to launch this masterclass in Malaysia, Vietnam, and India in 2022. The only purpose of this is to now light a fire under every business leader's leader so that they can act with urgency for the climate emergency and exit fossil fuels. So this course is very important, I think, for all business leaders to quickly educate themselves on. And the reason we are doing this is because none of the business schools, none of the director programs in the world bring this subject together the way we put it together. Any of their courses, because they are missing half the tricks, half the subjects in the climate emergency. So that is why when you asked me, Watson, what shall we call this series? I said, let's call it 21st Century Challenges. And each week, each month, we will focus on one challenge. And today we are focusing on the climate emergency. And I hope everyone who has listened so far has learned something about the climate emergency and why businesses and everyone needs to act.
Absolutely. I'm sure many people will know, because I feel that many people, they don't know about sustainability and climate change. So from this episode alone, I'm sure they will learn a lot. And other thing is, Dr. Fernando, I think many people don't know about Down to Earth with Zac Efron. So many things they can learn from that if they watch it.
Absolutely. In fact, there are quite a few Netflix documentaries that I want to recommend to everyone watching this program today to quickly go and watch and educate themselves, right? And the first recommendation I have is a program developed by Sir David Attenborough and Johan Rockström, Professor Rockström of Sweden. And this is called Crossing Planetary Boundaries, right? Crossing planetary boundaries, because they will then understand how we have crossed the planetary boundary of extreme temperatures and how that is affecting our biodiversity, affecting our agriculture, affecting forest fires. So this is a very good documentary. I think it's under 1 hour, and I would recommend this as a go-to and watch urgently program. Number 2, there is a program called Cowspiracy, and there's a one called Plastic Piracy, and there's another one, two or three amazing documentaries that people can look at. Why? Because if they look at those documentaries, they will understand how the world is beginning to suffer dramatically in the world because of this inaction. Because what we really need initially is an education. And we need to first get the education right. So the other ones I want to recommend is also called Kiss the Ground by, again, Sir David Attenborough and David Attenborough. Then there's one called Cowspiracy, how continuing to eat beef is going to be another reason that is going to be increasing methane in the atmosphere. And that in turn is going to mess things up. And then I want to mention the one you mentioned, which is called Down to Earth by Zac Efron, which is a fantastic series of about 10 episodes on what every one of us can do to address the climate emergency in our personal life, as a business, or a national leader. Because I think the lacking matter at the moment is the fact that no one seems to understand. We have moved from the climate change era in the 1987 to a massive climate emergency that is going to hit all of us and is hitting all of us every day. You have to just watch the extreme weather news update. And this is going to wipe out all these so-called great profit development and economic development. Much better to fix the climate emergency by exiting fossil fuels before we start trying to grow the business and trying to grow GDPs. Because if we don't do that, all this so-called GDP growth, so-called profit growth, and all the banks that are full of this money, that money will not be worth the paper it's printed on. You might as well burn all that money, because it will anyway, all our economies will be drowning in 20-foot sea level rises. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I think, yeah, Zach, I think they're coming up with a new episode, Down to Earth, in 2022. They're going to release it. And yes, Dr. Fernando, just we wanted to touch on one final question. So it's a very important question, actually. So what are the best practices in countries and businesses addressing to climate change?
Okay, so I think let's start with national level, country level. Okay, so the nations have two kinds of leaders. In fact, businesses also have two kinds of leaders, right? So I would like to call them 18th and 19th century leaders and 21st century leaders. These are the two kinds of leaders that we have on the planet today. 18th and 19th century leaders and 21st century leaders. So to answer this question, let's ask the question. So what are the 4 characteristics of a 21st century leader that we need to see to consider them a 21st century leader? But before I do that, I want to first tell you, Michael, that the world is full of 18th and 19th century leaders. And that today. So I can tell you without betting an eyelid, about 90% of the world's leaders are 18th and 19th century leaders. About 97% of the business leaders are 18th and 19th century leaders. About 90% of majority of the organizations, which are multilateral agencies and organizations like that, are led by 92% 18th and 19th century leaders. And when I look at industries, one of the industries that are two industries are directly contributing to the climate emergency problem we are facing in terms of persisting with fossil fuels and in terms of funding. So what are these two industries? Industry 1 is the fossil fuel industry. So when we talk about the fossil fuel industry, we are talking of every company on the planet which is making and selling coal power in the world. So the two or three big companies are Koch brothers in the USA, which are the biggest owner of coal power plants in the world, and Adani Coal in India, which is amongst the 2 biggest polluting coal power companies in the planet. And coal power is the most debilitating fossil fuel. When you burn that, the impact is 5 times greater than even when you burn petroleum, okay, in terms of warming the planet and polluting the planet. Right. So we have the fossil fuel industry, and who are the companies in the fossil fuel industry? First, I talked about coal power. Now we come to petroleum companies. So who are the companies who are basically contributing directly to the climate emergency and extreme weather in the planet, even though they have known scientifically from 1987 that if they continue to burn fossil fuels, this will cause the climate emergency which you and I are facing today, because they too have ignored the science for 34 years. So who are these companies? ExxonMobil in the USA is the #1 contributor to the climate emergency. British Petroleum Shell, Caltex, Chevron, Saudi Aramco, you name any petroleum corporation, even the China Petroleum, Indian Oil. I'm telling you, these are the fossil fuel companies of the planet who are directly responsible for the climate emergency in terms of global warming and extreme weather incidents. The second industry that is directly responsible for this are the banking and financial institutions of the world. Why? Because these fossil fuel companies come to these banks so that they can get money and continue to burn the planet up and dig for more oil and continuously ruin the planet. So now the question is, we have already come to the conclusion that the fossil fuel companies, including the coal power companies, are led by 18th or 19th century leaders who have absolutely no respect or interest in saving the planet, but only want to end up with a big profit for their companies and to give their CEOs and directors a good dividend and owners a good dividend and end up with great CEO rewards, right? They have put their profit before the planet and people of the world. The second category is, of course, banking industry. So who are the banks which are funding the fossil fuel industry? Number one bank that is funding the fossil fuel industry today is JP Morgan in the USA. Number two is Bank of America. Number three is Citigroup, all the city banks in the world. Number four is none other than HSBC Bank, which all of us know operating even in our country. Then you have Standard Chartered Bank. Then you have Barclays Bank. Then you have Deutsche Bank. Then you have Mitsubishi Bank and Sumitomo Bank. Now, what are these companies doing? They are funding the likes of Adani Coal and the oil industry in the world, right? And then they're trying to greenwash by saying we are also doing some nice little things for the planet. We are trying to launch climate bonds and we are trying to do all these strange things without stopping the funding of fossil fuels. This is, for me to talk about best practice, I must first talk about the bad practices that are happening in the world today. And these two sectors have directly impacted the climate emergency more than any other industry. But I want to continue with some of the other industries which are negatively impacting the climate emergency. Then we have the automotive transport industry. So the companies that are making fossil fuel driven vehicles and the companies that are making fossil fuel driven trucks, fossil fuel driven planes, fossil fuel driven ships, container ships, and fossil fuel driven transportation. So all those companies doing that are also directly contributing to the climate emergency because they are not taking the emergency factor into account and trying to make non-fossil fuel sectorial products and services for the human being. Right. The fourth category of impact to the climate emergency, I have already covered the fossil fuel industry. Number two, I am now talking about the banking industry. Then number three, I talked about the automotive and transport industry, right? Airlines, ships and cars and buses and coaches. The fourth sector that is directly impacting the climate emergency, believe it or not, is the apparel industry, because we end up throwing mountains and mountains of garments at the end of every year, every month, which then contributes to a massive climate emergency problem, because all the resources we have used to make clothes, and every garment uses thousands of liters of water, right? And I remember even to make 1 kilo of rice, we need 2,500 liters of water. Okay, to make one ham sandwich, we need nearly 167 liters of water, or a chicken sandwich. Out of beef sandwich. Okay. Now, these companies are using up a lot of the world's fresh water and then contributing to a massive climate crisis in the apparel sector, because the clothes, most of them are not biodegradable, because they are now made with a lot of synthetic yarn, and synthetic yarn is a petroleum byproduct, just like plastics, and they don't biodegrade for 500 to 1,000 years. So you're now creating another climate emergency in that industry. The fifth industry that is contributing to this is now the plastic industry, the single-use plastic industry. So who is the biggest polluter in terms of single-use plastics in the planet? Number one polluter is none other than Coca-Cola company. Number two polluter is Pepsi-Cola company. Number three polluter, and the 4, 5, 6 are companies like Nestle, Perfetti, Danone, Mars, Unilever, Nestle are all making single-use plastic containers for a lot of their products, which end up in landfill or in the ocean. And these then, we now have the Great Pacific Plastic Patch, which is now the size of nearly half the size of Australia in the Pacific Ocean of plastic dirt that has got accumulated. Wow. And one of the greenwashing attempts by the plastic industry is the word, we recycle plastics. Now, I want to tell everyone watching this program that is an absolute lie and not to be believed, because out of all the plastic, single-use plastics that is ending up in the Great Pacific Patch and in all the landfills of the world, in all the rivers of the world, from these 5 companies, do you know what percentage we are recycling, Watson? Do you want to guess?
Maybe 70%. It's just a guess.
You know what I like? That is what people think is the figure. All the people in the world think 70% of single-use plastics are recycled. And because of that, we think all we have to do is, when we finish a plastic container, just throw it into the dustbin. Somebody will collect it and go and recycle it. Am I right?
Yes.
So now let me give you the actual figure.
Okay.
And you will be shocked when I tell you the actual figure, because the world's plastic polluting companies want us to believe that they're recycling 70%, but the actual figure is less than 3%.
Oh, 3%.
Less than 3% of the world's single-use plastics are being recycled, which means 97% end up either in the ocean or in a landfill. That is the fact. But we are made to believe that 70% is being recycled by all these companies, which is an absolute greenwash. Just like the banks, I told you, they do one nice thing while funding the fossil fuel industry. Okay? So now we talk about plastic pollution, which is absolutely another crisis. I already talked about apparel sector pollution. Okay? So now, when I look at these 5 industries, they are the 5 biggest polluters of the planet. But I missed out one, and I need to talk about that, because to go to best practice, I want to give you the worst practice. And 18th, 19th century leaders are leading all these companies I have talked to you about. But I'm going to then give you the stories of the 21st century leaders in every sector, okay? And in every nation. But no point telling you that without telling you the worst practice and the climate denying, science denying leaders that have ruined the planet. The last sector is agriculture. So agriculture is also a sector contributing to the climate emergency. And how does the agriculture sector contribute to the climate emergency? Number one, the agriculture sector has basically been responsible in the last 34 years for destroying over 70 to 80% of all the natural forest cover in the world, in the name of developing crops for the people. But developing crops for the people is one thing, but every crop, when you add up the amount of water that is needed to make these crops, 70% of the world's fresh water goes into making agricultural crops. 70%. So they have destroyed 80% of the forests in the world, and they are using up 70% of the fresh water in the world in the name of development. Now, what happens when you do that? So the agricultural sector is then when you end up wasting food, when you end up throwing things into the dustbin, because for any item made with all this precious water and resources, means you are throwing into the dustbin thousands of liters of water which went into making these products and food that you and I eat. So wastage is another massive reason. Agricultural wastage, Michael, accounts for 40% of every agricultural product we make. 40% is lost in supply chain losses and storage losses, and the waste that we create. 40%. So for every 1 kilo of food you and I eat, actually 500 grams have got thrown out every time. Now that is a colossal waste, and that is the next industry that needs to worry about it. And also agriculture, eating beef is probably the worst thing for the planet, because the cows end up releasing methane gas, which is among the top 3 greenhouse gases after carbon dioxide. So one way for us to change our habits, for every industry, I will now go through best practice and what we should do. Okay. Now, I have gone through about 7 industries and national leadership. And now I will talk, all this time I have talked about 18th and 19th century leaders in 7 industries. Now let's go one by one and talk about best practice. Okay. I already told you that we have only 3% of world leaders in business or national who are one bit interested than our 21st century leaders. 97% are 18th and 19th century leaders who are giving us stories like, let's fix this in 2040, let's fix this in 2050, let's fix this in 2060, when the crisis is going to hit us in 2005. I mean, that's a bit like Greta Thunberg, the great Swedish activist. She says our house is on fire, meaning our planet is on fire. That's what we mean by global warming.
Yeah.
That is like saying the house is on fire, let's put the fire out in 2030, 2040, 2050, 2060, let it burn for the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Do you think any house is going to last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years when it's burning now? Absolutely. You have to put the fire out in the next month, in the next day, in the next week. These people putting forest fires out in Australia, which destroyed 3 billion animals. The forest fires that are happening right now in California, which is destroying so many lives. The forest fires happening in Siberia. The Brazilian forest fires, due to absolute ignoring science, are all going to come and haunt us, because what we are doing is actually not addressing. Do you think all the people putting the fires out say, okay, let's put the forest fire next week, let's put the forest fire out 10 years from now, let's send the fire brigade 10 years from now to put the fire out? The reason I'm telling you that is because 18th and 19th century leaders are addressing the fact that our house is on fire as if it can be put out in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years time without putting it out today. What we need are leaders who put it out today. Right. So now I'm going to shift to answering your question. I had to first give you the bad side and the side that is real before we get to the good side. Okay. So now what do we know about 21st century leadership? First, let me define 21st century leadership, and then I will go through national leaders and leaders in every single one of these industries who we can look up to and say, aha, these are amongst the 3% of 21st century leaders. Because today's subject is 21st century challenges, right? So the first characteristic of a 21st century leader is that he or she respects and understands and listens to science, number one. Because the characteristic of an 18th and 19th century leader is they deny the science and they deny the need to listen to any advice, and they put profit before planet and people. Profit before planet and people. That is what they do in the 18th and 19th century, right? So first characteristic is the 21st century leader will respect and understand the word science. We don't need them to become scientists. We want them to simply respect science. And all of us in our schools have learned grade 4, 5 science. And if we remember what we learned at grade 4, 5, that if you keep burning anything, it will melt anything. That if we remember that simple lesson of grade 6 science, and as leaders remember that, we won't have a science denying leadership. Okay, but we are full of science denying leaders in all these industries. I have already given you all the companies who are part of the problem of climate emergency. Number two characteristic of a 21st century leader is that they will have what I call a triple bottom line mindset. And what do I mean by that? The triple bottom line is basically people, planet, and profit. When you report on those three issues, we call it a triple bottom line leadership. So the problem of a triple bottom line leader will try to create a nation or a business which has a fantastic, sustainable economic growth model, which does not harm the planet, and which helps people progress. So when I talk of a triple bottom line mindset leader, I'm talking of a leader who puts people and planet before profit. The second characteristic of a 21st century leader is that they will put people and planet before profit in every single decision they make for the country, for the company, for the organization, or for the home. In your home, you will put people and planet before profit. You will not go rushing to buy the next bottle of plastic Coca-Cola. You will probably say, I'm not going to drink Coca-Cola, but if Coca-Cola has an aluminum can or a glass bottle, I will buy it. That is doing the same thing of triple bottom line leadership in the home. Okay? Right. The third characteristic of a 21st century leader is a 21st century leader is one who has an urgency to impact the climate emergency. Urgency to impact the climate emergency. And I have already given you what the climate emergency is, burning fossil fuels. Then if you are having an urgency to impact the climate emergency, you will exit fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy. So any leader who does not have an urgency to address the climate emergency, I call them 18th and 19th century leaders. And all you have to do is to put on the television and look at the news to listen to company leaders who are trying to solve the climate emergency problem by exiting fossil fuels in 2030, 2040, 2050. As soon as you hear that kind of year, you can immediately put that person in a 18th and 19th century leadership box, because they have no urgency for the climate emergency that needs action by 2025 and not action one day after 2025. Even 2030 is too late. Right. The fourth and final characteristic of a 21st century leader is that they will embed the 21st century board leadership model in their board agenda, in their corporate agenda, in their management committee agenda, in their operations committee agenda, in their leadership agenda, because they will know that that is the only comprehensive model that addresses all the issues that I have now talked about in terms of the climate emergency. So now let's go on to, so who are the best practice and examples? Okay, so let me go one by one. Let's talk first about national leaders. Okay, when you talk about national leaders, there are few countries which have understood this problem and are taking the climate emergency serious. So the first national leader I want to talk about is the person today heading the European Union.
Okay.
European Union's head is Ursula von der Leyen, a German former defense minister, is now the head of the European Union. And one of the first things that she did when she took over the leadership of the European Union about 2 years ago was she said, we must launch the new European Green Deal, which insists that everything manufactured in the European Union must be manufactured by renewable energy sources. Every ingredient that is sourced must be a renewable source and not a source that is depleting. And last but not least, it made sure that every country moves to 100% renewable energy in the next 5 years. So that you can see that she's beginning to put a lot of pressure getting the European Union to move forward. And I would consider her one of the exemplary 21st century leaders of the world. Who else would I put into that box? Joe Biden, when he took over the United States, inherited the nation that suffered dramatically from 18th century leadership before that. Because the leader before that ignored the science, ignored the health emergency, and basically jumped out of the Paris Agreement. Now we have a leader who is a 21st century leader who is trying to fix all these three things in the world. So I would consider him a 21st century leader, but he too needs to exit fossil fuels fast and accelerate the climate emergency actions instead of waiting to do this in 2030, 2040, 2050. Besides those two people, in a national leadership sense, even leaders we had in America before, like Barack Obama, was also very much a 21st century leader. When I look at the European Union, I want to single out the Scandinavian countries. So Denmark, Sweden, those Scandinavian countries Norway have been championing the 21st century agenda. But I must mention that Norway yet has a fossil fuel industry in their country, and they have a brand called Standard Oil. They have not closed that down yet. So to me, while Norway has done some good things, they have also continuing to do something which is totally unacceptable and 18th century leadership. Now, Costa Rica is another country which has a 21st century leadership, and Bhutan. These two countries have also 21st century leaders who are working tirelessly to address the climate emergency. And Bhutan and Costa Rica are probably shining examples of this activity. Okay. Now, after that, I would say Angela Merkel of Germany is another good example of a 21st century leader who has been doing the right thing for the climate emergency. But even she is influenced by the polluting fossil fuel industry and the polluting automobile industry. I can see that she's under pressure, but anyway, she's moving out this year.
Okay.
Now, besides those 5 or 6 leaders, I will not name any other leader as a 21st century leader in the world today. Sadly, because they are denying the science, they are ignoring triple bottom line mindset, they have no urgency for the climate emergency, and most of them are not embedding the 21st century leadership model in their national strategies and their global strategies. Now, the next group of organizations we need to talk about are the multilateral agencies, right? Now, what do I feel about the multilateral agencies? Now, I will tell you, the multilateral agencies are the ones who first came up with the 1987 report on the climate change problem. But what have they done between 1987 and 2021 to confirm that they have had any impact based on the 1987 report? And I can tell you nothing, because they have not achieved anything between 1987 and 2021, because the gigatons have gone up to 33 tons, the parts per million have gone to 420 parts per million, and the temperatures have gone up. So if all these 34 years, these multilateral agency leaders had had any impact, we would have had a holding position or a reduction. We are having a massive increase. So to me, they have all failed the planet. Now we'll go industry by industry. So the first industry I talked about, I think, was the fossil fuel industry. Am I right? I talked about the fossil fuel industry because they are directly complicit in the problem. So let me tell you one exemplary leader in the fossil fuel industry. In the company called Danish Oil and Gas was 80% to 90% of Denmark's oil and gas industry. And in 2009, a fantastic leader called Henrik Poulsen moved into leading Danish oil and gas. Within 2009 and 2021, in the last 12 years, this amazing 21st century leader has converted the Danish oil and gas company today to be a company called Ørsted, which is the world leader in wind energy. 100% wind energy driven. How did an oil and gas company move into become a world leader in renewable energy? Leadership, 21st century leadership. So that to me is a shining example of a world-class business leader who went into a national business and turned it around today to become part of the solution to the climate emergency from becoming part of the pollution and the problem of climate emergency. Brilliant. Let's move to the next. It's an amazing story, right? The second leader, a second industry I talked to you about, Michael, was the industry of automobile and transportation, right?
Yes.
The shining star in that sector, is none other than Elon Musk of Tesla. Okay. Shining star for a 21st century leader who respects science. He's a scientist himself because he is a PhD in science. Yeah. He respects science. He has a triple bottom line mindset. He has basically an urgency for the climate emergency because all his companies, all his four companies are companies which are part of the solution to the climate emergency, not part of the pollution. And lastly, he has embedded 21st century thinking in terms of a model to his business agenda. So what are his companies? The Tesla Motor Company is now among the top 2 electric car companies in the world and is the innovator of electric cars and driving this in an amazing way in the world. And today, electric cars are beginning to outsell combustion vehicles in Europe almost 3:1. So we can see that Tesla's leader is a shining example of a 21st century leader. The third sector I think I talked about was the plastic, single-use plastic industry, correct?
Yeah.
And I can tell you that today I don't know of any company that is in the plastic pollution business, which I already told you the worst companies, which have done anything worth talking about as at today, right? So I can't even name a 21st century leader. I can tell you 99.9% of all the leaders there are 18th or 19th century leaders. The fourth sector I talked about was the apparel sector, the clothing sector, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, who is the shining star there? The shining star in the clothing sector is a 21st century leader called Yvon Chouinard of a company called Patagonia. Patagonia is one of the few apparel companies in the world who are totally focused on reuse, recycling, and looking at clothing to be repaired and not to be buying new clothing. In fact, they always in the advertisement say, don't buy a new item of clothing. Come to us with your old item of clothing which you bought from Patagonia. We will repair it and make it look like new for you. Don't buy a new garment. And they have 40,000 repair centers in the world. Their entire business model is repair, reuse, and recycle. Now, that is a classic example of a 21st century leader. Right. Now I come to the fifth industry, which is the banking industry, correct? Because I talked about the banking industry. There are two shining stars in the banking industry. All the others, I would name and shame them as 18th century leaders. Who are the two shining stars? Number one, the head of the European Investment Bank, Werner Hoyer, German gentleman, and he leads the European Investment Bank, which is the biggest multilateral lending institution in the world, bigger than IMF and World Bank combined. So they disburse about 80 billion euros per annum. So what is the amazing leadership he has given? He has banned the European Investment Bank from investing in any fossil fuel project from 2021.
Wow.
Now, what do you think of that for a 21st century leadership? Isn't that just amazing that we have a leader who banned that whole story? And the reason I know this very well is I wrote a 21st century case study this July for the INSEAD Business School. As an executive in residence, one of the key things I do as part of my contribution to education, business education, is to create case studies that give us the business case for doing the right thing. Because there are enough of business leaders who say, if you do the right thing, you are going to lose. But the case study I developed was doing business cases. So I have done been involved in nearly 12 case studies at the INSEAD Business School. Wow. And this recent case study I did was for them, called the European Investment Bank leading the effort for impacting the climate emergency. This case study was published in April 2021 by the INSEAD Business School, and I would recommend it to be read by anyone who is directly or indirectly involved in the banking and finance industry of the world, because it shows that you can do the right thing and not do the wrong thing and yet be a very profitable bank. Okay. And I told you earlier on, JP Morgan, HSBC, Standard Chartered, Barclays Bank, Deutsche Bank, Citibank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Mitsubishi Bank, Sumitomo Bank are all led by 18th and 19th century leaders, because they are yet investing massive sums of money in the fossil fuel industry. Even after the 2015 Paris Agreement, these are the banks investing most money in the fossil fuel industry. So do they respect science? No. Do they respect the triple bottom line of putting before? Do they respect, have an urgency for the climate emergency? No. And last but not least, these are the banks who are basically not embedding the 21st century leadership model into their strategies. So then the next industry we talked about was the FMCG industry of making food and drinks and all of these things for us. The closest to having a 21st century leader in this industry is a man called Paul Pullman, who led Unilever between 2009 and 2020, I think. In those 11 years, he did an amazing project in Unilever called the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which had a great impact in halving Unilever's carbon emissions, but doubling its business. Halving Unilever's impact and doubling its business. Okay, so this is a leader we can all be proud about, and we can study about and take inspiration from as a 21st century leader. Okay, now let's look at the IT industry, because the world's top 4 companies now are all technology companies. So what is the world's biggest company now? None other than Google, who is our Alphabet. Then you have Microsoft and Amazon, and these are the big companies of the world today, the top 3. The beautiful thing I can report to you today is every one of the biggest companies on the planet today. The biggest companies used to be the polluting fossil fuel companies and banks. No longer. The biggest companies today are 100% the IT companies, technology companies. What is the brilliant story about these companies? The leader of Google or Alphabet is none other than Sundar Pichai. And Sundar Pichai is a 21st century leader because he has ensured that his company has gone to 100% renewable energy by 2020. Already. They are not waiting for 2030. They are not waiting for 2040. They are not waiting for 2050. They have done it now, and they have a new strategy for energy transition, because electricity is only one element of energy. They have now committed that by 2030, the very latest, 24/7, everything that Google does or Alphabet does will be 100% climate negative, which means they will not be contributing any emissions to the planet.
Amazing.
Now, I call that stunning leadership for the 21st century. The same is true of Apple. Apple is also among the top 5 companies, and Tim Cook has also gone to 100% renewable energy for electricity. So these are the 2 outstanding tech company leaders who are 21st century leaders and not 18th century leaders. One of the things that the tech companies have to do now with urgency is to make sure all their data centers in the world are 100% green data centers and no longer problems in terms of energy consumption. Because as you know, if the world's 4 biggest companies are all tech companies, they are all going to be using massive amounts of energy for the data centers. Right. So I have now given you about 5 or 6 outstanding world leaders in terms of the. Is there any sector I have missed out, Michael?
Perfect, Dr. Fernando. Perfect. You had covered our main topic, so perfect for the episode 1. You have covered all the topics, so we really appreciate that, and we really appreciate your time, Dr. Fernando. You made time for us even you were busy, so we really appreciate that, and thank you very much. So hopefully by our next episode next month, we'll have some questions from some viewers as well as students. So we'll get a few questions from them. And thank you very much, Dr. Fernando. Thank you so much. You want to say any final words before we wrap up the episode?
Yes. Thanks, Michael. I must say, I respect your organization and any organization that is investing your time to put effort to communicate the meaning of the word climate emergency and 21st century challenges to anyone. So any company in the world, any leader in the world, any human being in the planet who is doing anything to try to make sure that people understand the issue of climate emergency is, to me, a voice in the right direction for the 21st century. So even without trying to pander to your ego, I can tell you, you are now a part of a 21st century leadership team. And the big message I want to give every single one watching this program is, you can now identify, using my 4 criteria, the difference between a 21st century leader and an 18th and 19th century leader. Right? I want to wrap up by reminding you, a 21st century leader respects science. A 21st century leader puts planet and people before profit. A 21st century leader has an urgency to act on the climate emergency by 2025, 2030, the latest. Any leader talking of doing anything for the planet after that is absolutely living on another planet, and they should be taking Virgin Galactic or and taking a ticket out of the planet and staying in another planet. Because any leader who talks about doing anything to save the climate in after 2025, 30 is basically saying, I don't care. Lastly, that they will embed the 21st century leadership model in their business agenda and their national agenda. So if you are watching this program, my message to you in conclusion is, stop being a 18th, 19th century leader. Today, after listening to this program, start being a 21st century leader from this very moment, and don't postpone doing that, starting with what you can do in your own home. Thank you very much, Watson, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Fernando, and we wish you the same.